the host's genes were disrupted, meaning that they either increased, decreased, shut off entirely, or shut on entirely their production of protein. So if something is pumping out proteins at random that wasn't supposed to, what could that mean? This list will come up several times tonight. It could be allergenic, toxic, carcinogenic, anti-nutritional. If you shut down a gene, what could that mean? Some studies have found laboratory animals have died, etc. We don't really know all the potential ramifications, but we do know that the most common result of genetic modification is surprises. Surprise side effects. When you genetically modify a bacteria to create L-tryptophan more economically, it means you produce more L-tryptophan in this fermentation broth. They also added genes to produce different enzymes. So all of a sudden you have a bunch of different enzymes and L-tryptophan together working out and doing some very complex interactions. One of the world's experts at biosynthesis of L-tryptophan said you can end up with creating new compounds that you weren't expecting. These new compounds can then interact with existing compounds to create yet new compounds. This could explain those 6 contaminants. Moreover, the actual L-tryptophan itself is toxic to the bacteria. So in high quantities, the bacteria may do something to modify the tryptophan or the environment to protect itself. So we have an incredible amount of opportunity for unpredicted side effects. And this is the process of genetic modification, and this is used to create enzymes and additives and cooking agents and aspartame, NutraSweet, the genetic modification of bacteria or fungus. That's the first category of genetically modified products. Now, the second category is milk products. Milk products from cows that have been injected with genetically engineered bovine growth hormone. It's interesting that in the process of approving genetically modified bovine growth hormone, a number of scientists spoke out at the FDA. And one talked about how the process was putting the public at risk, and he had a supervisory role in the evaluation of RBGH until he made that comment in public, and then he was stripped of responsibilities and sent to work at a trailer at an experimental farm on a different project. A division director who said that the industry had too much control over what the FDA was doing, he was forced out. A veterinarian who was asking for too many tests, it was slowing the approval process down, he was fired. The remaining whistleblowers decided to be anonymous. They wrote an anonymous letter to Congress and said that there was conflict of interest and fraud going on at the agency. They talked about Margaret Miller, who, for Monsanto, created a bunch of experiments on RBGH, then moved to the FDA to evaluate her own research. She also, according to this letter, at random, changed the amount of allowable antibiotics in milk. In order to approve this injection, it was going to increase infections, it was going to increase the use of antibiotics, so she raised the level from 1 part per 100 million to 1 part per million, a 100-fold increase. When the Congress people eventually did an investigation, they also looked into Michael Taylor. Michael Taylor, just before becoming the #2 man in the FDA in charge of policy, the man who decided that milk from cows injected with RBGH does not have to be labeled. He was formerly attorney for Monsanto Corporation. Monsanto produces RBGH. He later became a high-ranking official in the USDA and later the vice president for Monsanto. And that's not unique. If we look into the current and previous administrations, there's a revolving door. In fact, one interesting comment, someone described the Monsanto board of directors as a virtual retirement home for former Clinton administrators. And in addition to seeing the kind of pressure that was put on the US scientists, 10 years later when Canada was evaluating RBGH, the same thing happened there. 6 scientists testified before Parliament there that they had been pressured, and one was told that if he didn't approve RBGH, he'd be shipped off or no one would hear from him again. They said that Monsanto offered them a bribe of $1 to $2 million if they approved the RBGH without further research. Monsanto responded on national Canadian TV that they had misunderstood an offer for research money. Documents were stolen out of a locked file cabinet. And they eventually got permission to approve, actually to review the FDA's evaluation of RBGH and wrote a volume this thick on how it was full of gaps and improper assumptions and omissions, which I analyzed in my chapter 3 called Spilled Milk. And I described some of the research that the FDA used to defend approval. For example, I think you'll find this one entertaining, this bit of quote science. The FDA scientists wrote an article in Science magazine and said that the amount of natural bovine growth hormone in milk does not increase substantially in cows treated with RBGH, but even if it did increase, it wouldn't matter because 90% is destroyed during pasteurization. I looked into this with the help of some other investigators, and it turns out there actually was, according to the citations that they were using, a 26% increase in this growth hormone. A 26% increase in a hormone. But apparently that wasn't significant because the researchers only injected 3 cows. And I read in the study, they injected the cows with 10.6 milligrams per day, parentheses, the approximate dose. Now, by the time I read this, I'd been doing a lot of investigation, and when it said approximate dose, my red flags went up, and I called a friend of mine who I knew would give me the straight scoop because he had published in his dairy newsletter some stolen documents from the FDA years earlier. And he had showed that when Monsanto wanted to verify that injections did not interfere with fertility, the researchers apparently added cows to the study that were pregnant before injection. When cows got sick, they were removed from studies altogether. It also showed that immediately following injection, there was an increase in hormone levels in the blood of up to 1,000-fold. So I said to my friend Pete Harden, Pete, it says 10.6 milligrams per day, the average dose, the approximate dose. He immediately said, no one injects every day. It would be economically infeasible. Dairy farmers inject every 2 weeks. I said, how much do they inject? He said 500 milligrams, not 10.6. The researchers actually used a different company's RBGH, one that was never approved, slightly different formulation, but used a daily dose instead of that big biweekly dose. And we know from the stolen documents that on the biweekly dose, hormone levels skyrocket by as much as 1,000-fold. So perhaps they chose a daily dose to avoid that spike in hormone levels in the milk. But it doesn't matter, right? Because 90% is destroyed during pasteurization. Well, the same undergraduate did that research also. And they heated milk for 30 minutes at 162 degrees. Normally at that temperature, you heat milk for 15 seconds and call it pasteurized. So they heated milk 120 times longer. Imagine heating a turkey 120 times longer than the instructions. But they only destroyed 19%. They only destroyed 19%. They added powdered hormone, 146 times the natural occurring level of hormone, heated it 120 times longer, and were then able to destroy 90%. And that's what the FDA quoted. That was what the FDA used as a basis for safety. Now, we don't know if this particular hormone is bad for human beings. We may not even have receptors for it. But that's not the only thing that increases in milk. Antibiotics increase in milk, pus increases in milk. That's treated from RBGH, but also IGF-1, insulin-like growth factor 1. 2 very sophisticated journals published this information in 1998. Premenopausal women with high levels of IGF-1 are 7 times more likely to develop breast cancer. Outside of family history, it's the #1 risk factor. Men are 4 times more likely to develop prostate cancer. IGF-1 is also implicated in colon and lung cancer. IGF-1 in milk is identical chemically to the IGF-1 in human beings, and milk drinkers tend to have higher levels of IGF-1. And the milk from cows treated with RBGH has higher levels of IGF-1. Sobering news, isn't it? So that's the second category. Milk, dairy products from cows treated with genetically modified bovine growth hormone. So let's talk about the first category, the one that most people know about, the crops. And let's talk about the FDA once again. Because in 1992, the FDA formulated a policy on genetically modified crops. They said no testing was necessary. If the industry that created the foods believed it were safe, then they could bring it on the market without even telling the FDA. No long-term safety testing required, no notification required. And they justified this policy with the following sentence. We know of no information showing that the foods created from these new methods differ in any meaningful or uniform way. We know of no information. Remember that. I'm going to test you on it. We know of no information. And that's what Americans believed. They figured that the FDA scientists got together, looked around, couldn't find any information, said, oh, must be the same. Years later, a friend of mine spearheaded a lawsuit against the FDA. He got 44,000 documents, internal, formerly secret documents, and it showed what was really going on. The scientists said these foods can create, remember that list? Allergies, toxins, carcinogens or new diseases, antibiotic-resistant diseases, that's a new one, nutritional problems. They also said these problems would not necessarily be obvious to those who create the foods, and therefore they must be subjected to long-term safety testing before being fed to the public. One person summarizing all the comments from the scientists of the agency said, the technical experts at the agency believe that these foods are different than foods created from normal conventional means, and they have different risks. You remember what the comment was in the policy? We know of no difference. You know who was in charge of that policy? Michael Taylor, former attorney to Monsanto. He was in charge overseeing the rewriting of this policy. One comment from a scientist at the FDA made public from the lawsuit was, what's happened to this document? It's become a very political document, very pro-industry. It doesn't address consumer concerns. And he said this is the industry's pet idea, namely that there's no unintended side effects. But the data doesn't support this. So they were aware that there could be unintended side effects. When the experts in the Canadian Royal Society looked at it, they said the default prediction of genetic modification is unintended side effects, and that there's no justification to assume that they're safe. David Suzuki says, if a politician or a scientist tells you that GM foods are safe, he's either very stupid or lying. David Suzuki is a geneticist. You may have seen him on PBS. So this was the concern by the scientists, but the number 2 person at the FDA, Michael Taylor, and even the number 1 person, the commissioner. The commissioner wrote a letter, which became public from the lawsuit, which said, the biotechnology policy is now in tune with the intentions of the general biotechnology policy of the White House, which is to also ensure the safe and speedy development of the US biotechnology industry. There was a huge movement to popularize genetic engineering because America was the breadbasket of the world, and America was the provider of technology for the world. Let's put them together. This was also industry's goal. When Arthur Anderson, a consultant for Monsanto, described how they had consulted with Monsanto, they said, describe your ideal future in 15 to 20 years. And the Monsanto executive said, we see a world in which 100% of all commercial seeds are genetically modified and patented. And then the Arthur Anderson consultant announced that they worked backwards from that goal to create the strategy and tactics to achieve it. And key to their success was the influence that Monsanto had in the government, which was legendary. One commenter who was in charge of biotechnology issues for about 20 years said that the regulatory agencies in the government have done everything that big agribusiness has asked them to do and told them to do. So that's the situation we face. They recommended long-term safety testing, the scientists, but the policymakers did not. In fact, when that document was sent up to higher levels of political influence, Someone from the Office of Management and Budget said, we should put a sentence in here which says, the foods created from these new methods are safer, because it's a more precise method of creating foods. So as the evaluation went up the political ladder, the foods got safer and safer. So what happens when you do submit these foods to long-term safety testing? I would like to know too. Do you know how many animal feeding studies have been done on genetically modified foods and published? Anyone? There's actually 10. 2 were done independently, 8 were done by industry, but several of those 8 were commercial feeding studies. They weren't really safety studies. Now I'll tell you about industry-sponsored versus independently sponsored studies. Aspartame, NutraSweet. It's created through genetic modification. It was responsible for 80% of complaints one year to the FDA about potential health side effects. Between 1985 and 1995, approximately 166 studies were done on aspartame, divided almost evenly between independently sponsored and company sponsored. 100% of the independently sponsored studies raised questions about aspartame. Some indicated the possibility of brain tumors. What percentage, by coincidence, of the company-sponsored studies raised a question? 0. So 2 of the 10 studies were independently done. 8 were done by industry. Let's talk about those 2. Let's talk about one of those 2. They were done by the same person, Dr. Arpad Pusztai. Dr. Arpad Pusztai, leading researcher in his field. It's a brand of protein called lectin. He was working at the leading nutritional laboratory in Europe. He was invited there 35 years or 37 years ago by a Nobel laureate to work in his laboratory, and he'd become the leader in his field. He had over 300 scientific studies done, about 12 books edited or written, and he was a money magnet for grant money because he was so thorough and well thought of. And he won a grant over 27 competitors, which was the big biotech grant from the British government. They were to create the protocol for long-term safety testing, the long-awaited protocol. This was actually in the mid-90s. Nothing had been published at that point, so it was all new territory. But he was called in because he had done nutritional safety testing for years. And he was leading a 20-member team in 3 different institutions. And as part of their creating of the protocol, which was to be adopted by both the United Kingdom and also eventually by Europe, they created a genetically modified potato. The potato was genetically modified to produce an insecticide. Now let's back up here for just a second and talk about that aspect of crops that are registered as pesticides, because you eat them. There are certain corn that we eat that's genetically modified to produce an insecticide called Bt. Cotton also is genetically modified to produce Bt. We eat cottonseed oil. It's interesting that farmers have told me that when they give cows a choice, cows reject genetically modified corn. Normally, cows will eat the corn to the end of the trough. Whatever's there, they'll continue eating till it's gone. The first farmer put in a trough, genetically modified on one side, conventional on the other. He let his 25 cows in, and they all congregated on one side of the trough and never ate the ones on the other side. When this was told to other farmers, they repeated this study over and over again with cows and hogs, letting 2 or 3 into a pen at once, and they had 2 different troughs. The first one genetically modified corn, the second one conventional corn, and the same thing happened over and over and over again. They'd go up to the first trough, they'd smell it, maybe they'd taste it, they'd go to the next trough, they'd finish it off. They'd go back to this one, they'd smell it, and then they'd walk away. Geese avoided eating genetically modified Roundup Ready soybeans from a field. They only ate the conventional on the side of the field. Rats were fed a tomato, and they didn't eat it. I think this is a great selling point. Are rats eating your tomatoes? Well, you can have this tomato which survives longer on your shelf, and rats reject it. Well, they force-fed the rats. This was a study that was actually reviewed by the FDA, and they developed stomach lesions. 7 of 40 died within 2 weeks. They were replaced in the study. The tomatoes were approved. Anyway, let's get back to Arpad Pusztai's potatoes. He was genetically engineering a potato to produce an insecticide. The insecticide was a lectin. That was what he was an expert in. And this lectin he knew most about. He had studied it for 6.5 years and was sure that it was harmless to humans and rats. So he was surprised to discover that the rats that were fed the genetically modified potato developed problems. But the rats that were fed the potato spiked with this lectin insecticide did not develop the problems, nor did the rats who were just eating the potatoes. It was only those that were genetically modified to produce the lectin. So this is significant information. He had taken a gene from the snowdrop plant and put it into the potato to produce this protein, which was an insecticide. He knew the protein was safe. So why did his rats develop potentially precancerous cell growth in the intestines and stomach, smaller brains, livers, and testicles, partial atrophy of the liver, damaged immune system?